And we're live. It is Wednesday, June 3rd, 2020, 5 o'clock p.m. Kate, what's on your mind?
Not as much as usual, thank God. I have decided, because the world is always going to be exploding and something is always going to be happening in social media and other crazy stuff, that I just had to, after 6 years of kind of working constantly, even when I tried to take a vacation, like I went to Zion National Park and like did the whole Utah trips tour, and like halfway through it ended up like having a viral series of tweets and having to write an op-ed for the New York Times, which is like not a bad problem to have, but it meant that I did not work. I was like or that I was working and I was not on vacation. Similar thing happened to me when I just went to Thailand. I just like haven't had a day or a series of days in which I actually haven't had any deliverables that I have due to anyone, or reading that I have to get done, or meetings I have to go to, or classes I have to plan. And I kind of realized that I was finally hitting that point. And so I had I was turned in my first draft. It's going to be weeks of back and forth edits eventually. But I turned in my last draft to the New Yorker for my big Facebook piece. And then I was like, I'm just like not gonna do anything for a while. So I put up an away message or an out of office message. I hired an assistant to basically filter my emails for me and tell me when something was critical, and to text me to tell me that it was critical. And that is it. And it's been a glorious day. I slept until 11. I got up. I like wandered around in the backyard looking for turkey feathers, as I like to do, for like a solid, 20 to 40 minutes, and gardened. And that was it. And everything is still coated in dust, but it's amazing how much less it bothers me when I'm like not in, like no one is pestering me and I don't feel like I have to answer. I've given myself permission to not answer my thing. Oh, we have our guest here. Hi, Clint. Welcome to the show.
Hello. Thanks for having me.
Sorry, you came in the middle of my random monologue about my self-imposed vacation, but it's great to have you.
And
here.
You're on it right now?
Well, ish. Yes. This is not work. This is fun. This is a drink every day with Ben and really smart people that we get to come on our show, like you.
Here, let me get my
69th. The 69th day in a row that we have done Lieu of Fun at 5 o'clock, but it's the first time I haven't said the key intro words. We're not allowed to have fun anymore, but in lieu of fun, we have Clint Watts with us today, and that's actually pretty cool because Clint is a pretty like one of the 500 people in the world who genuinely make it more interesting. And
thank you. I appreciate that. We got to share that.
To see your face and have
we got to share that in my house.
Voice.
I should put you on speaker so people in my house think the same.
So I don't quite know how to introduce Clint, but let me give it a shot here because it's a little bit of a complicated introduction. Clint became famous because he had this incredible testimony before the Senate Judiciary Committee in which he had the temerity to speak the truth about why Russian active measures worked. And some of you know what I'm talking about right now. Some of you may not, but this became a kind of viral sensation, I think, because Clint said some things that were so staring us all in the face, and yet a lot of people hadn't bothered to articulate or hadn't thought hard enough to see the simple reality before them. And for a lot of people, Clint is that testimony. It's this kind of upright former FBI agent saying these things. But for those of you who haven't read his book, or listened instead to his Lawfare podcast interview about his book.
That's right.
He's
That's right. I
got
think you were the first.
Yeah, no, that was a really great conversation. I mean, he's got an incredible backstory of how he got there and how he got into the field of disinformation. And so I guess one of the first things I want to say is, don't think the Clint Watts story is as simple as whatever you're going to see over the next hour, because like we're going to have an interesting conversation, but Clint Watts is actually more interesting. That's true of a lot of our guests, but it's actually more interesting than the sum of whatever we're going to talk about today. Former FBI agent, disinformation specialist, truth speaker, kind of all around interesting guy. Clint Watts, we're not allowed to have fun anymore, but it's a pleasure to have you.
Hey, thanks for having me. What a great intro. Yeah, I've got to share that in my household. I'm being serious, Ben. I appreciate it. Yeah, thanks for having me on another day of interesting times. I think it was yesterday. I was like thinking back to the testimony, and that I was worried about the line between fact or fiction. That was kind of in the part that everybody keyed on, was like, if we lose track of fact and fiction, that's when democracy really will go haywire. And man, it feels like we're in that space. My team has been doing a lot of disinfo tracking around COVID-19, which has turned into now the protest and what is Antifa or not Antifa, and what is, who is this guy who shows up in full battle rattle, with no insignia and no name, and won't say who they're working for. It's really been a crazy time the last 3 months of trying to figure out, man, just beyond the Russia stuff, just what is actually happening, in the world. Can we believe what we're seeing? Even when we see it, do we believe it? Because it's so frightening and kind of devastating, I think.
So let's start there. I mean, we have two ongoing areas that are rife with misinformation, and I suspect also disinformation, that are playing out every day. One is COVID-19, and one is, the killing of George Floyd and the resulting protests / riot / looting. How do you propose to tell fact from fiction in the saturation media environment that we've got in those two areas?
It has become almost impossible to know with 100% certainty, because the government is no longer the carrier of absolute truth and data, right? Like, we used to be able to, even in the federal government, it didn't matter what party it was. I remember working at FBI headquarters, I think it was around 2012. I was working for Tom, my boss there. And one of my jobs was to go and verify a lot of information, and make sure that the numbers were right. Like, that was critical. And who holds the numbers in the organization, and make sure that they're correct and that we're briefing it correctly. Man, today, I just don't know when I hear things come out. I trust a lot of the institutional leaders, but whether it's how many cases of COVID do we have when we know people aren't getting tested for COVID? What does China say in terms of when it started versus what does Russia say versus what the US says? And they all say it's a bioweapon, and no one thinks it is, right? Like, it's almost impossible. And then now with the protest and this Antifa stuff over the last few days, and the White House had just tweeted out the exact conspiracy yesterday that we were trying to refute, which is the brick conspiracy, that bricks have been placed around in major cities, and Antifa is stacking them there so that they can go and, vandalize places. Man, it's just impossible to stay up with what the ground truth is around anything.
Antifa.
Yes.
How would you characterize, does it exist? And if so, what is it?
Yeah. So Antifa as an organization is not a thing, but it might be by the end of the week, and the way that it's going.
Can
because
you say more about that?
That's nicely put.
so
What do you,
what's
I don't get it. What is that? What does that mean?
so I came across this like starting about 3 years ago is when it started popping up, and there is the Antifa movement, which is generally, people upset about fascists, which they consider to be white supremacists, authoritarians, and that sort of thing, which we've seen a lot of, and that's in response to Charlottesville, but even before that. And so, but it was a movement. It wasn't like
It wasn't
top-down
centralized.
structured organization like we have with the base, which is a white supremacist group, right? We've been panicked about for the last year and a half. And FBI has actually done, without any terrorist designation, done a really good job of going after a lot of these folks. And so what people were seeing, though, is a lot of the property damage, which is usually attached to black bloc, which was, if you remember the WTO sort of riots in Seattle, like 20 years back, right? That's the property damage, vandalism, that sort of thing, black bloc. Now, they would show up at a protest, but they might be amongst peaceful protesters. This is how these things sort of go, right? Every protest movement, though, some form of extremist will try and embed themselves in it from whatever angle. We've seen this over decades. So it was interesting, though, that somehow the media narrative could attach Antifa as the thing. And then, well, anything that is coming from a protest is Antifa. And so I would be teaching law enforcement audiences counterterrorism, and I would do this exercise where it was usually about Al Qaeda, ISIS, and like how to understand your jurisdiction and what your risks are, what the ideologies are in your jurisdiction. And about 2 to 3 years ago, and I've done this all over the country, there just became this Antifa is my number one threat. And I was like, who is in Antifa? And they were like, well, we just got some guys and they show up at protests and they're crazy and they break stuff. And I go, okay, so like, what's their ideology? Well, they just want to protest. I'd be like, okay, articulate this.
They're anarchists.
Right, they're anarchists.
But they're not even organized anarchists. They're really like the literal physical manifestation of almost trolls on the internet, even though they have a little bit more ideology than trolls on the internet. Like they have a little bit more purpose, but they kind of go out there and do things randomly and like destroy things in the way that like trolls randomly attack people that you can't even expect and you don't know why.
They're basically a physical manifestation of Anonymous, right? It's the same. It's to the same degree. Ethos.
I thought Anonymous had a physical manifestation.
They do, and they have shown up at protests, and you'll see them particularly in Europe, around 2011, 12 in that era. And so look, Antifa, there are some towns that would have like an Antifa group that would show up to protest, and you'd see them get into fights with like the Proud Boys. Portland, Oregon is a great example of this. But in other towns, it's like 5 people calling themselves Antifa, and some black bloc people show up and start breaking stuff, and then some anarchists do show up from another group, right? It's kind of like an amalgamation. Antifa now has become just a sort of blanket term for an amalgamation of protesters that are doing damage. There's some organization in places, there's not in others. And what it reminds me of from the global war on terrorism days is the Muslim Brotherhood. Totally different, a religious-based group, but Muslim Brotherhood means wildly different things depending on the country you're in. And we would go around kind of looking at Muslim Brotherhood as counterterrorism. And yeah, if you're in certain countries, Muslim Brotherhood is Hamas, right? It's like a real terrorist group. And other places, the Muslim Brotherhood is like the YMCA. It's like a boys and club or something like that. So
I don't think that analogy is quite right, though.
What do you mean in terms of Antifa?
No, I think it actually overstates it wrongly equates the degree of organization associated with Antifa with the Muslim Brotherhood. Muslim Brotherhood,
right. I agree with you.
Was founded in Egypt. It has organizational kind of chapters all over the world that are radically different. It represents everything from one of the pretty mainstream political parties in Israel, that is to say the Joint Arab List is part Brotherhood, to an offshoot of the Brotherhood becomes Al-Qaeda.
Hardcore
right?
militants, yes.
I don't
Right.
want to like butt
And-
in with like this, but I think that what Clinton's point was like, not that it was not organized like that, but that kind
It
of in
can
the
mean a
same
lot
way
of-
that
yeah.
any small chapters of various organizations, even if they started from a centralized place, end up having kind of very different profiles in the various
No,
places they set up.
I agree with that. But my point is that every one of these organizations all over the Muslim world and the non-Muslim world that kind of organizes under the banner of the Brotherhood is actually an organization.
Right.
And
I
so
think I
whether
agree
it's-
with both of you. I agree with you, Ben. Yeah.
and so whether it's the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood is a real thing. It's a genuine organization. The thing about and the the Salafi Organization for Call and Combat, the old Tunisian group, is a real thing. They're very different real things. They're both organized under the Brotherhood in some sense, but they're real. Antifa seems to me more like saying bird watching, or like it's not like an organization at all. It's a
Oh, that's
a
a really
movement.
great
Kind of-
analogy, actually. I quite like that. Everyone bird watches in a different way. There are some like basic things that everyone who bird watches kind of agrees
and there are
about.
some things, yeah, if you're a bird watcher, you're kind of like part of a culture of bird watching. And there are certain things, or your friend who we had on in lieu of fun, who keeps bees, right? Beekeeping, it's a thing. But that doesn't mean beekeeping is an organization. And I think Antifa, I have never seen evidence that Antifa is an organized movement, an organization, the way the constituent Muslim Brotherhood organizations are.
No.
So what am I getting
no.
wrong there, Clint?
No, I agree with you. I think there's two parts to it. One is that Antifa, I think the point that Kate, I think, was picking up on, Antifa in one place, it means something entirely different than Antifa in another. And that's kind of what I was trying to talk about with Muslim Brotherhood. It could be totally different things depending on the context of where you're at. I agree with you, Ben, in that it isn't as organized as Muslim Brotherhood. Muslim Brotherhood was a very organized thing, right? Like it's an organizational structure from the start. Antifa, you could go to a place like Portland, Oregon. Antifa is going to be like a somewhat defined kind of group. They're going to have websites and things, and they're going to organize in certain ways, and they have their network. Then you can go to other places and maybe like, I'm just throwing this out there, an Antifa group in Pennsylvania is 5 people in their 40s and above who protest, right? Like it can mean totally wildly different things. They may coordinate online and sort of communicate with each other, but it's not like, hey, we're all going out at 5 o'clock. This is your job. This is your job. This is your job. And here's our money. And this is where it's coming from, which is the way it's being communicated from the White House and into the media. And I worry about the media because they tend to grab onto these terminologies. And even if it doesn't exist, they'll make it. So long story, I'll make it real short, is Al-Qaeda was this way after 9/11. Like after the Al-Qaeda attacks were pulled off, there was Al-Qaeda, but there was a debate about how many people were in Al-Qaeda. And I think most estimates were like 400, 500 people. And so there were times where raids would happen in other countries, or you go arrest people and you'd be like, and Zubaida is kind of the case of this. So you are Al-Qaeda's number 8. And they go, I'm number 8? Like they didn't know, like we had created an organization of them. And then you would encounter these guys and they go, I thought I was number 3, or maybe I'm number 2. Like we had put the structure on top of what was a cell-based, terrorist group and extremists that had been to training camps together and had networked. Some of them were even in competition with bin Laden to be the head of kind of this amorphous organizational structure. So yeah, and you see that with like, who's the leader of Occupy, right? Like if you went back 8 or 9 years and they'd be like, we're leaderless, so.
I love that. I think that that's super, super interesting. Just what you said about Al-Qaeda, because that is distinctively, and I was like a pretty like with it, pretty informed person when 9/11 happened. And I was like, the way that all of these television anchors are talking about Al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden as a center is like as just like, oh, it's everyone knows what this is, and it's a thing that's existed forever, and it's very well organized, and we need to go, we've been neglecting pulling out these weeds, and we need to go and like pull out these, like, to destroy this cell or do all of the, like, destroy this organization. We've just like let it happen, but it's an organization. And I was like, that was like, I always felt like maybe I missed something and I was horribly misinformed. And I was like, after 9/11, because I was like, my understanding of things was that it was much more soft and fuzzy than all of that. So that actually is really, that actually makes me, in a dark way, kind of really validates a lot for me.
I actually ran a survey, Kate. When I Selected Wisdom was a blog I had. That's where that name came from, my Twitter handle. And I ran surveys, and one of the surveys was a survey. This is around 2011 or 12. What is Al Qaeda? And I listed out like 20 entities and organizations and people. And I'm like, are they in Al Qaeda or not? Listed. And the answers were wildly different. And then I ran another one, was like, how many people are in Al Qaeda? And I ran it from 1 to 10, 10 to 20, up to 10, 50,000. You get wildly different answers too. And then
you don't blame the media. They need narratives. People, this is how people reason and grasp things and think of things. They need stories, they need narratives, they need enemies, they need structures. And like you, to go after things, it's very hard to go after Antifa because it doesn't have any of like the organizational structure that we've just talked about, or any analogy to an organizational structure that we just talked about. It makes your job much harder. So obviously people search for that. So you can't blame them, but at the same time, sometimes things just are completely decentralized and amorphous and really.
And by the way, none of that means that if people under the banner of Antifa are showing up and committing crimes or, enticing others to commit crimes in the context of these protests to try to provoke police backlash, that they shouldn't be prosecuted.
Right.
Like that's a different question. And by the way, color me on the side of prosecuting a bunch of people. I think, I don't think that I don't think that the killing of George Floyd is a particularly good excuse to steal lots of things that don't belong to you or break windows of small businesses that are trying to, survive in a COVID-19 environment. But that's a different question from whether there is a terrorist group called Antifa that is, using these protests to organize on behalf of radical leftism.
Right.
We have a great question.
Okay, good.
Oh, sorry, go ahead, and then we'll turn to Lieu's question, which I think pithily identifies a core issue that we're kind of dancing around here.
So my fear is that we will have an Antifa now, even if there isn't like a real organization, because you're seeing people say like, can I get an Antifa flag? What is the Antifa symbol? And so this happened with Al Qaeda. After Al Qaeda had their 9/11 moment, other groups are like, I'm going to rebrand myself as Al Qaeda in such and such place, right? Like it created this like self-fulfilling prophecy where people were like trying to create an organization. So now I'm worried in the sense that there will be people seeking out, the identity of an organization. It can actually create itself from what is really just a loose collection of protest movements.
Lieu, the floor is yours. It's a deep question and it's a really interesting one.
Yeah, and I think it's probably really hard too. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Simply that, how do you go about defining what is an organization? Seems like you have a lot of different choices about what that might be. Thank you.
Yeah. So usually, do you want me to take this, Ben, or do you want to go with it? You'll have the right legal answers about it, I'm sure.
Well, give your thoughts, and then I'll give some of the legal background to it. But I actually think the non-legal answer here is more interesting than the legal one.
Yeah, I think it's shared identity and, essentially announcing it. So with Al Qaeda, for example, we used to say if they had declared an oath, bayat, to bin Laden, then they were committing themselves to the organization. The second one is that if they had a role in a defined organization, like fundraiser, specific entity they were doing. Second was, do they receive or contribute to the organization so that they can either conduct operations or sustain themselves or whatever it might be, or do they receive equipment support, material support, those sorts of things from the organization. And then the last part, which is where like people on the fringe used to get caught in a legal sort of quandary around a terrorist organization, was operational direction, ideological support, and then material support. Kind of like, are those inputs showing up around this organization that would put you into it, rather than someone who legally believes the same thing but doesn't, enact violence or participate in the group's organization, that sort of like-minded supporter. But it was always a super fuzzy one, which is why, like, in many ways, the government likes organizations like Hezbollah or other terrorist organizations that have a really defined structure, because it makes it easier for them to adjudicate, in terms of prosecution and pursuit and counterterrorism and those sorts of things. Yeah, and Al Qaeda linked is one of the most dangerous words that's ever been uttered, and I phrases I should say, and I worry that Antifa linked is going to be the new one where you go, oh boy. Was this somebody who went to a meeting once with a person who is Antifa that broke a window, in a protest, or beat someone up with a bat, or, something even worse? That's what I'm really worried about that now.
So that's a pretty coherent answer, pretty comprehensive answer. Let me just add a few things. First of all, you don't need an organization to have a conspiracy, right? A conspiracy is any two people who agree upon an illegal objective and take some overt action in pursuit of the illegal scheme. And so, but an organization is a very attractive thing, as Clint says, for investigators, because it can be said to have some kind of juridical personality that's different from the personality of the people involved. So let's take, for example, the relationship between Lawfare and Benjamin Wittes, right? Lawfare isn't, and this gets to the value of incorporation as part of the definition of organization, which is incomplete but important. Lawfare legally exists independently of me, right? It's a 501c3 incorporated nonprofit, and it has a board of directors that I'm a member of, right? So if I get hit by a bus tomorrow, Lawfare continues to exist, right? That is a important in the sort of legal definition of an organization or a corporation. That kind of independent juridical personality is a very important thing. But there are these organizations, and Al Qaeda is a good example of them, that don't have that, right? There's no incorporation of Al Qaeda in the state of Delaware, and yet have very clearly defined structures. And so the basic answer to your question, Lieu, at least legally, is an organization is defined by the degree of, and this is using the word in the definition of the word, organization in the structure, right? How much structure to it is, how predictable is it? Is it simply people who agree on a bunch of stuff? Kate and I agree about a bunch of things. We also disagree about a bunch of things. We meet every day on In Lieu of Fun. That doesn't mean there's an organization, right? On the other hand,
God knows that's not true, given how haphazard this show is.
Yes, exactly. A group of people who get together and engage in coordinated activity with a known structure in order to accomplish common objectives is the more it looks like that, the more you can say it is an organization. And that is a complex and gauzy thing, and one that is, at the end of the day, pretty hard to define.
I mean, I just think that also to Clint, not to add another kind of gloss to the organization question, but I do think that it's a question in a lot of it that's instrumental. Calling something an organization gets it more, and like having something that is like you can give like leadership more deliverables on and tell them response, like, here, if we like do this drone attack, we're going to get this number of people, and this is like the top, they're in the top level of this organization that we have created the organization for, and we're going to like launch an entire operation this way. That just kind of like creates incentive and kind of instrumental deliverables for things that I think, it's the same reason that like we invented the entire notion of conspiracy in criminal justice, which was to go after like Gotti and to go after organized crime, which is in fact its own, like, and racketeering, which are in fact, they're just like crimes that we made up in order to like really like apply to like people that we wanted, like organizations that we wanted to take down, that were internal to the United States, at the time, and still are. But I mean, these are all just definitions that like we kind of like, I guess I'm always kind of a little bit of an instrumentalist, but I see law enforcement and these types of things as being especially like one of those areas.
Can we talk about the counterexample from last year?
Sure.
Where there was organization and we don't designate, and in fact, there's pushback to it. So I testified to Senate Homeland Affairs last September, I think-ish. But it was about the white supremacist movement. And there was the argument that it's not organized. It's just a bunch of it's the bad apples theory, right? It was like very clear from what was going on that by the pace of attacks and the degree to which they cite each other and know each other, that an organization is forming. And so it did. There were named groups that emerged. The most famous one was called Atomwaffen, and Atomwaffen actually created divisions to give themselves structure, like by regions and like organizations. And so they clearly had met the threshold of violence. You had many cases where there were murders, right, and people were killed, property damage and other things. You had the base then, more recently, that emerges. They're taking pictures of themselves as the base, which a base is also translated to Al-Qaeda and other languages, which would give you some idea of structure, right? And so I had advocated that the FBI director, I'm nervous about it because of the political stuff. Everyone was worried about this exact scenario we're in right now, where politics take over and people start designating people as terrorists based on organizational ties that may or may not be there. But I wanted to advocate that the FBI director should be able to set a threshold to decide, okay, we need now to put these things as a organization investigatively, because if you chase them all as one-off leads in 56 field offices around the country, you don't put connections together that are there. And you're pursuing the cases one at a time. You're not going after leaders and financing, those sorts of things. And most of law enforcement pushed against me because they were like, we don't need the politics of the designation process. And if they're committing crimes in the United States, we can pursue them in the court of law. Just like Ben said, if they're Antifa folks that are doing property damage or hurting people, doing assaults or killing people, then we pursue them under the charge. There's no statute that needs to be made for domestic terrorist organization designation, where we may need to do that for overseas groups. We don't need to do that at home, because if they commit a crime, we just pursue it as a crime. And Mike German at the ACLU now, who's a former FBI agent, he argues very much against designation for political reasons and thinks there's plenty of tools that are there. So I think it's interesting that a year ago, the idea of designation was pushed down when we very clearly had a lot of white supremacists, popping up and killing people. And now we're talking about going after what is largely a protest movement and property damage as an organized collective that should be a terrorist group. It's really fascinating, the switch in 12 months. It was this time last year that we were talking about it.
Do you think that there is yeah, and I think that like what has happened in that ensuing year? And I also was going to say, this reminds me, Ben, I'm just gonna bookmark it. Kathleen Belew, who's at University of Chicago and is close to Ada Palmer, actually, is an expert. She has really followed all of kind of, I don't know if you're familiar with her work, Clint, but she follows white supremacists and specifically kind of has followed, I think, been embedded with a lot of the groups at various points. And she does amazing, she's a historian, and she does amazing field work about basically how these have not gone away. They have kind of gone into the background, into like, I guess we could say, a disorganized form in a lot of ways for many, many years. And now are resurfacing. And it's one of the things that I bring people's attention to when we talk now about social media's bias against conservatives, allegedly online, which was that like when a lot of the, if you talk to people who drafted the policies at Twitter or Facebook or YouTube, that a lot of the things that they were saying or doing at that time, like things were basically like people didn't want glorification of Hitler. And so that was like taken down, right? And that was where the line got set. And then at some point there was, in the last 15 years, there has been like, the line hasn't changed, just like more people have moved to the other side of it. And that is like actually kind of what we're seeing now over and over again with social media bias. And like, it's just kind of with like, or the social media bias is actually, they're just more people that are a little bit more mainstream that are doing these types of things. And I'm just curious if you agree with that, or if that's a general. Kathleen's point is, I thought, very well researched and seems correct to me.
Yeah, I think I agree. I mean, what's remarkable is that the internet's entire purpose was to connect everybody, and it worked great. And the good parts came out the first decade, and a lot of the bad parts came out the second decade. And social media accelerated both of us, right? So no one was like, what's going to happen when we take extremists on all corners of the planet and we now allow them to communicate and organize for free, online? It's pretty remarkable, like how quickly that happened. Like-minded people, from a lot of different terrorist groups found each other. And it's also interesting now how algorithmically with social media, people get their biases reinforced. And, we've talked about this in so many, the confirmation bias, implicit bias, exponential function of these groups is that, yeah, I am right, and I can identify everybody that agrees with me, and maybe my free speech is more important than your free speech, and now we argue back and forth about what the other groups can say. Is become like the craze. And oh, by the way, the social media company's got to be a neutral platform, which we've been in these sessions before. It's impossible to adjudicate, especially in a global scale. I don't know how they make it through the regulatory part. What I am just fascinated by, incel is another one, right? The incel movement is another one right now.
Oh my God, the incel movement is terrifying and has had real moments of people having mass violence and terror, what would be considered terrorist acts in another era, or maybe they are considered terrorist acts, which is another question, which is how you designate things to be terrorist, which I guess is like something that I'm also curious about if you have insight into, Clint.
So before you do though, I want to give an ongoing example of the point that Clint just made, which is, so on our YouTube feed, there is a gentleman who I assume is a male gentleman, who goes by the name, the devotee of George Smiley, which, by the way, is a bit of an offense to those of us who love the Smiley.
I like George Smiley. It's so terrible that this guy like co-opted it.
And I don't like the fact that this fellow has co-opted that name. And I don't like the fact that I'm about to talk about him using the name George Smiley. So, but that said, this person writes in the comments feed on the YouTube channel as every day as In Lieu of Fun progresses, disgusting, demeaning comments about Kate, and anti-Semitic comments about me. And here's like the example that I think is like a really interesting illustration of your point. So the first 10 years of the internet, right, are that Kate and I can kind of launch this show, right? And we don't have to have any network involved. And, you know, we're literally using between us probably not more than $2,500 of computer equipment and cameras. And the services that allow us to stream it are free. And we can develop an audience and people are interested to the extent that they're interested, right? The second 10 years of the audience of the internet is that I've got to engage with this asshole, right? And he's sitting here day after day after day saying disgusting things and dominating the feed, the comments feed of the YouTube channel. Until today, while you were talking, I kind of responded to him a little bit and said, look, dude, cut it out. You know, it's really uncool what you're doing. And so there's that leveling, right? On the one hand, I'm leveled and Kate is leveled with the networks. We can start our own show. And, you know, I did some yoga last night with a video on YouTube from a woman who just kind of started her own show. And that's really cool. That's the first generation leveling. But the second generation leveling is we spend our time on the show responding to some asshole who calls me a bartender and Kate a cupcake.
I like the drunken cupcake. I'm like, I'm
Drunken
never drunk on
cupcake,
this show. Like, I'm like, never. Like, I have done some things drunk before, but never this show. It's just like, oh.
It's like, and so there's a real, I think the leveling thing is a really complex thing that brings to the table a lot of your work, right? On the one hand, the Internet Research Agency is leveled with the Tennessee Republican Party. On the other hand, you know, you can have a real relationship with some Islamic fundamentalist, al-Shabaab radical who, literally until the day he gets killed. And so I'm interested in your thoughts about leveling. Is it ultimately a good thing or ultimately a bad thing? We get to have this show, but we have to deal with the self-declared devotee of George Smiley.
Can I just add one? Sorry, Clint, I don't mean to like.
Jump in.
But there's this other thing. Like when I think I've talked about it in the show before, when I was in the EDNY, we had a material support case with a kid who was like 19 and was like clearly lonely and had kind of been egged on by the FBI into he had started out maybe looking into jihadist things and then then we ultimately was like, could never get him on any type of material support. And so it ended up being lying to the FBI and it was this whole case. But related to that, it reminded me, I remember like reading, like doing all the reading for this case and all of like the background stuff and half of it was redacted and everything else. And this kind of brings us around to the incel point, which is that like, I'm about to say something really controversial. We're all kind of lonely and sad. And sometimes you really can't find anyone else or anything else to do, including whatever George Smiley's name is, but like his whole name, but like this guy who's like, why are you like, I don't spend my days watching shows to mock the people on them, right? Like that are at a level above me. There is some level of sadness and loneliness that the internet exposes in all of us. And then also kind of like brings these decentralized communities of lonely, angry, bitter people together or gives them a voice. And I think that like when that voice becomes really real, when they feed on it, when those groups come together and can be cathartic to each other and helpful, it's a good thing. Like the queer community is a great example of this. Historically, like censored and decentralized. now like, you know, they're out and they can like communicate and people can find other gay people online when they're 13 and like it's great. But there's all of this stuff where it's like you have these incel communities and it's like on the one hand, like I wonder that it wouldn't be a wonderful FBI like operation to infiltrate these incel communities and like give some hugs or like do something that was proactive in terms of like not to be super like just but I mean to apply some basic psychology principles to these groups.
Yeah.
Does that make any sense? I don't know
Totally.
if I'm being like I'm
So-
always too kumbaya on this show for some
No,
reason.
I've got too many good examples and too many like sad examples. So I'll start with yours, Kate. I'll come back to Vince. I remember one time I was trying to chat up a guy on Twitter who openly in the public, I was doing my ISIS and Al Qaeda assessments or whatever, and he was telling me I was wrong. And one of it was a big ISIS supporter, and he went quiet suddenly. And usually that was the signal like, oh, they're going to Syria, right? And they're going to become a fighter. And then he came back on Twitter and he's like, you know what? I'm renouncing ISIS and everything's fine. He's overseas. I was like, well, what the hell happened? He goes, well, I met a girl. And you go, okay, right? Like, so
This is
he
what
was
I'm saying.
either,
People are
I
bored.
wish devotee of George Smiley would meet a girl.
Yeah,
right.
exactly.
And so, yeah, you're like, okay, man, like, that's great, I guess, for you. And he's like, yeah, you know, I still believe in the cause or whatever, but, you know, I'm kind of busy right now. So like, every time you think there's like this operational conspiracy or something, sometimes it just be like, turns out the dude, he got hooked on video games and he went the other way, right? Or like something happened. At the same point, like when I was doing research for the book, there are some really good, we tried everything in counterterrorism because there was so much money, right? Like you could try everything. And I don't know if you're familiar with Moonshot CVE, which is run by Ross Frenette. And that's one of the more successful.
Wait. For those who aren't, walk it through, describe it briefly.
So Moonshot CVE, so countering violent extremism, when I say CVE, is a great example of like, we want to do the kumbaya and the right thing, and we want to demobilize people, but we always defer to the like DARE program of the 1980s, where we're going to go give kids a briefing about how bad drugs are, right? Or like how bad Al Qaeda was. It's like very few people join Al Qaeda and go to Syria. So like, that's not a very efficient way, and no metrics of success. So Moonshot took people that were former members of jihadist groups and white supremacist groups, put them on Facebook, and had them, Ross would explain it better, basically spot communities where they saw people who were vulnerable to radicalization, and then interact with them one-to-one with direct messaging. And they had pretty remarkable success. They were able to connect with people like Kate was talking about, and sort of like build relationships and talk to them about the dangers of like joining one of these extremist groups. Great. Then at the same point though, I was looking at research when I was writing the book, and I was always trying to investigate like, what are some tricks we can use to demobilize people or to bring people together or fight filter bubbles. And, you know, I wanted to do the nutrition labels for information and mandatory alternative feeds or opt-in feeds for Facebook. This is what a person who picks nothing you pick and shares nothing you pick is looking at, so people could see the other world. And it turns out, like when you look at Robert Putnam and a lot of the social capital research they tried to do after Bowling Alone, which I think is kind of the start of this, right? Kate was like, about 20, 30 years ago, associations are dying and communities are sort of ruined. And it was the results were not good. They were, people don't like being around people that don't think like them, look like them, and talk like them. Like, as much as they tried to force integration, the results weren't great.
Well, this is kind of what I mean, but it's not, that's why I'm not describing forced. I completely agree with you. Like, that's absolutely true. What I'm talking about is not forced integration. I'm getting like, you get a bunch of like, so you do hear a lot about, God, I'm forgetting this woman's name. She gives a lot of talks on like, she used to be a white supremacist. She has like Nazi tattoos on her face. And like, I don't know, she like is very, and she kind of like has come full circle and now goes and gives talks about like stopping. I've totally blanking on her name. She's pretty high profile, but like, she's the person that you need, right? Like there's kind of, there's got to be some type of like, there's, that you don't do it with like, I think it's a much longer haul with presenting people of like that look and come from different backgrounds as you, as having someone that like seems like he's like your friend or she's your friend, and then kind of whispers in your ear like, maybe we shouldn't like bomb this like Muslim owned bodega today, or like, doing something, and instead of it, just kind of, I just think that some of this could be like de-escalated internally by correctly placed people. But anyways, we've had a bunch of questions for you, and I don't want to suck up all the time myself. Tom McGuckin, you've been sitting there very patiently. Please give us your question.
Right. Can you guys hear me?
Yep.
We can.
Yeah. Hi, guys. I love this sitting here listening to you, particularly your drinks. I just noted that for you. But let me get to Clint. Okay, Clint, the DEA or the BuzzFeed just had an article about some memorandum that the DEA put out, and you may be aware of it, where they are now saying that we're going to go do covert surveillance and on people. I see here, I guess it's just people that they think are protesting. And I don't know whether this is significant or not. I don't know if you're familiar with this memo that BuzzFeed just put out today. Guys, I go back to the 60s. There was the Black Panthers, there was the Weathermen, there was the citizen, what was it, army that kidnapped that gal. But nonetheless, I just want to know, is this DEA grab of surveillance, the DEA surveils people all the time for drugs, I think, but is this significant with respect to the protesters? Is this something that's real? I just wanted to ask that question to you.
It's a good question. It's the story is broken by two very fine reporters at BuzzFeed. Clint, what do you make of it?
Well, it's interesting. I don't know what the DEA's jurisdiction is over the protest, but everything is a little confusing right now, like why they would be involved in protest if it has nothing to do with drug enforcement, right? Like that's weird. That's the first thing I just find strange. The second thing, and that maybe is just the Department of Justice saying we need more resources, and DEA, you can do this stuff and you do surveillance and we're going to use you. I don't know what that decision is. The second part, it is not completely unheard of for once there is violence at a certain threshold for agencies to be told to do what they think is preemptive intelligence, around a protest. But particularly in the state and local law enforcement, they never get involved unless there is violence or the threat of violence. So I'm curious, when and where they would do this and to what scale and what they would be authorized to use. I do think it's a little over the top and a lot more than what I would traditionally expect of protest movement stuff. But yeah, I don't feel like it's a total game changer. I don't think it's completely unique. I'm sure it's been done in the past. I think it's in combination with watching everything else that's going on right now, right?
I think that's the key point.
Yeah, unmarked, unlabeled guys in black gear showing up. You don't know who they work for. Bringing in the military. That I think is what it is. I'll let you go, Ben, because you probably have a little better perspective on the power stuff.
No, I mean, I think that's the key thing. So the DEA is statutorily restricted to drug enforcement. That's its mandate. But the Attorney General does have a certain limited set of authorities to kind of deploy them outside of that in certain circumstances, and usually requires a memo roughly like the one that you saw. It happens every now and then. It's not unheard of. And the thing that makes this super weird is two things. One is the point that Clint just made, which is that it comes in the context of, a kind of weird Little Green Men scenario where, a whole bunch of people who won't identify themselves patrolling the streets. And that's that's its own weird thing. But the second, the suggestion that their role is surveillance of protesters rather than sort of normal old law enforcement, which of course includes surveillance, but is broader than that. And law enforcement and the authority to surveil protesters is either there or it's not, depending on the behavior of the protesters, and depending on what precisely they're doing. And the idea that you would bring in the DEA to do covert surveillance is weird. That said, there's nothing per se that's unlawful or inappropriate about it. That said, I do think it's worth keeping a close eye on.
Yeah.
Michael Mann.
Not the climate scientist.
Not the climate scientist, Michael Mann, but a graduate student.
I do some climate
what's
research.
on your mind? That's
I have
kind of
a
cool that you're named Michael Mann and you do some climate research. It's kind of like being, but you're not the other Michael Mann who does climate science.
It's either that with TSA, well, never usually the scientist. It's always if I'm the director. I have to go back. I usually go back and forth depending on the context. But my question is, how would you describe like the 3%ers, like the far right militia? I'm curious because I'm in Albuquerque and they've kind of popped up at a lot of the marches, but no one like in terms of like the media here or activists really know what to make of them. They seem really nebulous in terms of, the organization, what they believe. Do you have any thoughts on them?
Yeah. So they're definitely an organization, right? Like,
so what are they, first of all?
So 3%ers, and I'm not going to classify it correctly because I'm not super deep into this. And I work with other folks that have brought this up in the past. So I don't want to misstate it, but they're essentially people that believe in defending the Constitution. They call themselves the 3% that will defend the Constitution basically to the end. I'm not wording it quite right, but they've been around a long time. It is common to people will identify themselves as 3%ers, and they'll have like chapters basically. They'll go and show up.
They're also really based around the Second Amendment.
Yes, Second Amendment defense and protection. You'll see them a lot, particularly down the southwest of the United States, Albuquerque, like you said, but Arizona, places like that. They're all over the country. Now, what's different about them is that you have to connect them to violence or violating crimes. And so I have to say, for the most part, there's always been this theory like, oh, the 3%ers would do something or whatever, but they have not. They have not gone around organizationally and killed people. They've not gone around and committed broad-based violence. They know their rights and tend to stay within them pretty carefully. And so I think that's the difference, is they're not trying to overthrow the government or create political change. I think that's the key distinguishing thing, is they are a legally protected entity in the sense that they're staying within their rights and they're not breaking the law or committing violence. So I think that's the big difference there. The weird thing though is that's going on right now, I think, in this country, is the use of what would be deemed in other countries as paramilitaries or proxies, in the sense that law enforcement shows up to keep the peace, and another group like 3% or another sort of hastily organized group shows up and they try and assert themselves in these spaces. But what is their legal authority to do anything? And it's usually none. And so it creates this weird situation where the conditions are ripe for it. And I think that's with the unlabeled, which has separate from the 3%ers, these guys, the little green men of America now that are showing up. If they told me, and I'm in a public place, if they come along and hit me with a bat or shove me out with a shield and I hit them back, why am I not entitled to defend myself, right? Like, it creates this whole, Kate, you and Ben, I'm curious from a legal perspective, like, unidentified, will not speak, not designating who they are, I have no idea what their authority is, comes and kicks my ass in the middle of the street, and I fight back, and then I get arrested.
Arrested just for assault or a specific something?
Protesting, yeah, like they're kind of just taking in mass.
You would be arrested for assault, but you would have a defense to the arrest, right?
Right.
So like, I mean, but in the scenario that you're talking about, if there was any type of, well, like a lot of crimes, it's he said, she said, it's, or
Right.
he said, or she said, she said, or like, it's not clear who hit who first. We have increasingly good kind of like context for this and evidence for this because people film so much, but you're exactly right. I think I mean, to your point, you would have a pretty clear self-defense.
Yeah.
But I think there's an antecedent question, which is to the extent that they assert authority over you and they order you to do something and
Right.
like back off or clear a space, and they're not willing to identify themselves, how do you have any basis for the assertion of authority, right? A cop who shows you his shield, right? That is a issue, that is a thing that was issued by the state or the city in the case of the District of Columbia that says I have the authority to do the things that I'm saying. But if, you know, some little green man standing in front of the Justice Department or standing, you know,
They're
will
just
only
private
say
citizens.
I
They're just
work for
private
the
citizens.
Justice Department. Well, except that they're standing there with guns, right? They're standing there exercising power. And I do think it's a totally legit question, and I don't know the answer to it. I think the answer actually probably turns on a really unsatisfying thing, but I'm not sure about this. But I think it's like if they're there for facilities protection reason, like they're there to protect the building of the Justice Department, that's one thing. And if they're basically telling you keep away from the building, then that's kind of like,
But
well, okay.
In this amount, sorry, just to clarify, are you saying that they've been hired to do that?
Well, I mean, this is not an imagined situation. This is what's going on in Washington right now.
Right, but that's what I'm asking. Are those people hired? Are they like hired by
we
government?
don't know who they are. All
Okay.
they're willing to tell reporters is we work for the Justice Department. The implication, the
How
assumption
did I miss
is that
this?
maybe they're, you know, Bureau of Prisons people who've been bussed in. Maybe they're, you know, Justice Department security forces. We don't know who they are. And I think the answer is if one of them walks you up to you on the street and tells you to do something, I don't think you're
this is
obliged to
precise. I
follow
completely
it.
agree with you. I wouldn't like, why would like that, especially as a woman, I'd be like, good luck getting to go into your car with you, dude. Like that's like
Right.
never gonna happen. But I think that this is Barry Friedman, who was on the show before, who does the Policing Project NYU and is brilliant on this, like had a really great tweet that was like, any non-plainclothes police officer, of which there should not be plainclothes police officers out on the streets right now in their police capacity, like should have a name badge, and like that is routine, and the same goes for federal law enforcement officers. And so this to me, like I mean, if I was a judge, if I was doing this, if something came in that was some type of lethal force, I would end up like, I don't know, I'm maybe like very optimistic about this and maybe I'm completely wrong, but I don't know how people would be expected to reasonably know. I just don't know how they would know. And if they were faced with lethal force, that they did something in response.
And I worry about the imposter syndrome stuff too. I mean, a lot of these guys don't look that much different from the guys who are showing up at the Michigan Capitol building, right? Like
exactly.
Weapons and stuff. And so you go, who am I? Whose authority to do what? It leads to like people thinking they're going to enforce the law, you know, under their rights. And I'm walking down the street and now I'm encountering this, or I'm peacefully protesting also a right I have, right? And then I'm encountering this. It just seems disaster inducing.
I mean, all of these symbols change their meaning so constantly, let alone like the markings of like what they're wearing or like whatever else in their behavior and their language. But I'll use a great example, which is that Pepe the Frog was like this, like signal of Donald Trump. But in the Hong Kong protests, it was weirdly taken up as like a Hong Kong pro-democracy, like a symbol. And so you would see people like carrying flags with Pepe the Frog on them, like down the streets of Hong Kong. It was a completely different same exact thing, completely different meaning. And I think that that's, I think that that's just this crazy moment that we live in which the meaning of
Well,
words, ideas just
it
change
is
so quickly.
it is a foundational principle of linguistics that the nature of the sign is arbitrary, right? And Pepe the Frog can mean white supremacy and pro-Trump whatever, or it can mean pro-democracy, right? I mean, Pepe the Frog is actually just a green cartoon character.
So Ben, you want me to do last word?
You want to take the last word, Clint? By all
No.
means.
Do you guys usually do it?
We usually
you should do
bring
it.
somebody in to do it, but you should take it.
So
Leave us with something wise, Clint.
I am hopeful that you're starting to see some counter pressures, right? Like from the public and people starting to kind of assert themselves about what they believe in a positive way, not always negative. I know I shouldn't be too optimistic, but I'm hoping that over the next couple of months between COVID and the protests and everything else, that this sort of like pushback results in some positive things. I think former President Obama is speaking right now, right? I've seen Admiral Mullen yesterday, talking about what are standards and norms. And so, yeah, what if this is a shot in the arm for democracy that 2 years from now, we kind of look at it and go, wow, people kind of decided as a society, like what they wanted to do. If we undertook law enforcement reforms in terms of treatment of African Americans, after this, and we really seriously did it, even though we never do, I would be very excited for the country, if we undertook that. So I'm going to try and end on an optimistic note, even though
what
I'm
a
never
lovely
an
note
optimist.
on which to end.
Yeah.
Clint Watts, thank you so much for joining us.
Clint,
Yeah,
this
thanks
was
for having me.
so great. Thank you for coming.
Yeah.
And
I hope I can do it
be
again sometime. Hit me up.
Indeed. We will be back tomorrow at 5 with David French, who is a fabulous conversationalist and a thoughtful, eloquent guy across a lot of subjects. He's really, really worth hearing from. And Kate, until then, what do we say?
In lieu of fun, if you can't have fun, come hang out with us.
More or less. Have a good evening, everybody.
Bye.
All right.